The sharp metallic crack of a single gunshot ripped through the thin mountain air, a sound utterly foreign to the valley's usual silence. It wasn't the familiar report of an American M16 or the controlled burst of an M4 carbine. This was the older, angrier bark of a Kalashnikov, a sound that spoke of different wars, different battlefields. The echo bounced off the stark, rocky cliffs, a solitary note of violence that left a profound silence in its wake. Sergeant Eva Rostova didn't hear the echo. Her entire world had narrowed to the circle of iron sights at the end of the battered rifle, and the figure of the Taliban commander 200 meters away. She saw him jerk, a puppet with its string cut, and collapse behind the rock he'd been using as a command post. The world rushed back in, the smell of cordite and dust, the coppery taste of fear in her mouth, the burning ache in her muscles. Her hands, cut and bleeding from the frantic climb, trembled as they held the ancient weapon. She slowly lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense. They had handed her this broken thing just hours ago. She remembered the smirk on Corporal Miller's face, barely hidden behind a mask of false concern. "Sorry, Sergeant. Armory's light. This is all that's left. It's seen some action, but it should fire." He'd handed over the old AK-47 like it was a trophy, its wood stock scratched and splintered, its barrel pitted with rust. She'd taken it, her own perfectly maintained M4 sitting useless in the rack behind him, its firing pin mysteriously sheared. It was sabotage, a deliberate act meant to render her useless, to prove a point. They thought a woman with a broken rifle was no threat at all. They were wrong. The ambush had been a storm of lead and noise. The patrol was pinned down in the narrow pass, taking fire from 3 sides. Radio calls for support died in a haze of static. Their comms were jammed. It was a perfect kill box. And in the midst of the chaos, she saw him. Corporal Miller wasn't just returning fire. He was signaling a quick, deliberate hand gesture toward the ridge where the commander was directing the attack. The betrayal was a cold knife in her gut, colder than the fear of the bullets whizzing past. Her soldiers were dying. That was the only thought that cut through the anger. Her soldiers. She had to do something. The AK jammed twice as she laid down covering fire. She cleared it with a brute force muscle memory she didn't know she possessed. The climb was a blur of scraping rock and straining muscle. Every loose stone that tumbled down felt like a death sentence. Every burst of enemy fire seemed aimed directly at her. She focused on the commander's position, a fixed point in a spinning world. She reached a small outcrop, her body screaming in protest. She had one chance, one impossible shot with a rifle that couldn't be trusted. She took a deep, shuddering breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the world held its breath. The silence that followed the shot was more terrifying than the ambush. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, broken only by the moan of the wind and the ragged breathing of the surviving soldiers. All eyes, American and Taliban alike, turned toward the ridge where their commander had fallen. The enemy's coordinated fire dissolved into confused shouts in Pashto. The momentum of the attack shattered in an instant. Eva didn't waste the precious seconds. Her body moved on pure instinct, training overriding the shock. She scrambled from her position, the rough rock tearing at her fatigues. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden quiet. She had to get back to her squad. The AK-47 felt like an anchor, but she clung to it. It was no longer just a piece of junk. It was evidence. It was the instrument of their salvation. Below, Corporal Miller stood frozen. The cold confidence he'd worn like armor was gone, replaced by a pale, sweating panic. He watched the ridge, waiting for the commander to stand back up, for the attack to resume. It didn't. His eyes darted wildly, finally landing on Eva as she half slid, half ran down the slope toward the platoon. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. In his, she saw the dawning horror of his failure. In hers, he saw only cold, unforgiving truth. He knew she had seen his signal. He knew she had made the shot. The betrayal was no longer a secret. One of the younger privates, a kid named Jenkins, was the first to break the spell. "Sergeant, you're hit," he yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Eva looked down. A dark stain was spreading across her sleeve where a rock or a stray round had grazed her arm. She hadn't even felt it. She shook her head, dismissing it. Jenkins, Davis, secure that northern flank. Now, they're leaderless, not stupid. Her voice, though hoarse from dust and exertion, cut through the confusion with the sharpness of a command. The soldiers reacted, their training kicking back in. They moved to form a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on the now silent ridges. Miller finally found his voice. "Rostova, you crazy bitch. You just got lucky. You could have gotten us all killed with that stunt." He took a step toward her, his anger a desperate, flailing thing. But the men didn't look at him. They looked at Eva. They looked at the blood on her sleeve, the dirt on her face, the ancient rifle in her hands. They had seen Miller's perfect ambush. They had seen her impossible climb. Eva didn't even look at him. Her focus was on her soldiers, on securing their position. "Check your ammo. Report in," she ordered, her voice low but steady. One by one, the calls came back. "Green on ammo. Light but good." "I'm okay, Sarge." The respect in their voices was new, forged in the fire of the last few minutes. It was a tangible thing, a wall that now stood between Miller and the rest of the platoon. He was alone. He took a half step back, his defiance crumbling under the weight of their silent judgment. The fight wasn't over, but the battle within the unit had just been won. The only sound was the wind and the frantic call of a distant bird, returning now that the guns had fallen silent. The return to the outpost was a funeral procession without a body. The battered Humvees kicked up a plume of dust that hung in the still air, a grim banner marking their return. Inside the lead vehicle, the silence was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. No one spoke. No one joked. The only sounds were the grind of the engine and the rattle of gear over rough terrain. Eva kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, the weight of the old AK-47 across her knees feeling like the only real thing in the world. Every bump in the road sent a fresh jolt of pain through her grazed arm, a dull, throbbing reminder of how close it had been. Corporal Miller sat rigidly opposite her, his face a stony mask, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted around the cramped interior, never settling, avoiding the gazes of the other 3 soldiers in the vehicle. These men, who had laughed with him that morning, now stared out of the windows or at their boots, their faces hard and closed. The trust that had bound them together was broken, and the pieces lay scattered somewhere back in that bloody mountain pass. Miller's betrayal wasn't just a personal act against Eva. It was a poison that had endangered every single one of them. They had all seen the hand signal. They had all drawn the same chilling conclusion. As the Humvee rolled through the main gate of the outpost, the usual post-patrol activity froze. Soldiers stopped what they were doing, their eyes tracking the vehicles. They saw the bullet pockmarks scarring the armor, the shattered windshield of the second truck, the exhausted, hollow-eyed expressions of the men who climbed out. The atmosphere shifted from routine to grim alert. Captain Walsh, the outpost commander, emerged from the operations center, his face etched with concern. His eyes scanned the returning patrol, doing a quick head count, and landed on Eva. He saw the blood on her sleeve, the ancient rifle in her hand, and the palpable tension radiating from her squad. "Sergeant Rostova, report to the TOC." Now, his voice was low, leaving no room for argument. He then turned his steely gaze to Miller. "You too, Corporal. The rest of you, get checked by the medic." The order was clear, and the platoon dispersed, moving with a heavy lethargy. The walk to the Tactical Operations Center felt longer than the climb up the ridge. Miller walked a few paces behind her, a condemned man approaching the gallows. Inside the sandbag-reinforced TOC, maps and radio equipment covered every surface. Captain Walsh closed the flimsy door, shutting out the outside world. "What in God's name happened out there, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice tight. Eva placed the broken AK-47 on the map table with a definitive thud. "We were ambushed in the Jari Pass, sir. A perfect kill box. Comms were jammed. They knew we were coming." She paused, her gaze flicking to Miller, who stood rigidly by the door. "And they were receiving signals from within our unit." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The accusation hung in the air, as sharp and dangerous as shrapnel. Captain Walsh's eyes narrowed, moving from the battered rifle to Eva's bloody arm, and finally settling on the pale, silent corporal. The debrief had become an interrogation. The air in the TOC was suddenly too thin, too hot. Captain Walsh's face, usually an unreadable mask of command, flickered with disbelief, then hardened into cold, grim understanding. He looked from Eva's steady, exhausted gaze to Miller's ashen, sweating face. The truth was in the silence, in the way Miller couldn't meet his eyes. "Is this true, Corporal?" Walsh's voice was low, a quiet rumble of thunder before storm. Miller flinched. His mouth opened, then closed. No denial came out. There was no lie he could craft that would explain the coordinated ambush, the jam comms, the hand signal multiple men had seen. His silence was a confession louder than any shout. Walsh didn't need to hear it. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his master sergeant, who moved to block the door. The atmosphere shifted from interrogation to arrest. "Secure his sidearm," Walsh ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. The master sergeant stepped forward, his movements efficient and precise. Miller offered no resistance as his weapon was taken, his head bowed, a man completely broken. He was led out not to the medic, but to the solitary confinement cell, his fate sealed with a quiet, devastating finality. Alone with the captain, the adrenaline that had been holding Eva up finally began to recede. A wave of bone-deep exhaustion washed over her. The throbbing in her arm intensified, a persistent, angry pulse. Captain Walsh let out a long, slow breath, the weight of the betrayal settling on his shoulders. He looked at the old AK on his map table, a bizarre artifact in the sterile command post. "Start from the beginning, Sergeant. Leave nothing out." Eva did. Her voice was raw, but steady as she detailed the pre-patrol sabotage, the feel of the broken firing pin in her own rifle, the way Miller had so helpfully provided the only available replacement. She described the ambush, the precise enemy positions, the moment she saw Miller's hand cut through the air. She spoke of the climb, the desperate gamble, the feel of the worn wooden stock against her cheek as she lined up the impossible shot. She didn't boast. She simply reported the facts, her testimony a clear, clinical account of survival and treason. When she finished, the room was silent again. Captain Walsh stared at the map, his finger tracing the route through the Jari Pass. He finally looked up, his eyes holding a new, profound respect. "You understand what you've done, Sergeant? You didn't just save your squad. You uncovered a cancer within this unit. You stopped a traitor and a high-value target with a museum piece." He shook his head, a gesture of sheer awe. "They handed you a broken rifle, a death sentence, and you used it to save everyone." He didn't mention a medal. He didn't need to. The look on his face was a recognition far more valuable. "Now, for God's sake, go see the medic." "That's an order." The medic's tent was a world away from the tension of the TOC, a small island of bright light and antiseptic smell amidst the dust and dread of the outpost. The corpsman, a young specialist named Rivera, worked with a quiet efficiency, cleaning the gash on Eva's arm. The sting of the disinfectant was a sharp, clean pain, a welcome distraction from the deeper ache of the day's events. Rivera didn't ask questions. The grim set of Eva's face and the blood on her sleeve were a language every soldier in the outpost understood. He simply did his job, his hands gentle and sure. As he bandaged the wound, the flimsy fabric door of the tent was pushed aside. Private Jenkins stood there, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. His face was pale beneath a layer of grime, his eyes wide with a mixture of residual fear and something else, something like awe. "Sergeant," he began, his voice a little unsteady. We all thank you." The words were inadequate, and he knew it. He shuffled his feet, looking down at the ground. "I saw him. Miller. I saw what he did. We all would have bought it back there if it wasn't for you." Before Eva could respond, others from the squad began to filter in. Davis, whose quick covering fire had given her the precious seconds she needed to break away. Henderson, the radio operator who had fought through the jamming to finally get a distress call out. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Their presence was its own statement. They stood there, a silent, solemn circle of gratitude and solidarity. The resentment that had simmered when she first arrived, the dismissive glances, the tested loyalties, all of it had been burned away in the fire of the ambush. She was no longer the female sergeant they had to tolerate. She was Sergeant Rostova, who had climbed a mountain with a junk rifle and saved their lives. The moment was broken by the distant, familiar whump 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 of approaching helicopter rotors. The sound grew rapidly, a deafening thunder that shook the very ground. It was a flight of 2 Black Hawks coming in fast and low. Reinforcements, or perhaps the investigators, coming to collect their traitor. The men in the tent straightened up, the spell broken. The war was moving on, already drawing the next chapter. Eva nodded to her squad, a silent dismissal. They filed out back to their duties, their postures a little taller, their bond irrevocably forged. She stood up, testing her bandaged arm. The pain was still there, but it was manageable. She walked out of the tent, squinting against the rotor wash that kicked up a stinging storm of dust and gravel. The Black Hawks settled onto the landing zone in a cloud of brown dirt, their rotors slowly winding down. The drama of the day was far from over. Miller was in custody, but the why remained a mystery. Who was he working for? How long had it been going on? The question swirled in her mind like the settling dust. The immediate fight was won, but a deeper, more shadowy battle was just beginning. The dust from the Black Hawks had not yet settled when 2 men in crisp, unmarked combat fatigues strode purposefully across the landing zone. They moved with an air of cold authority that bypassed the usual chain of command, their eyes scanning the outpost with a detached, analytical efficiency. They didn't look like regular army. They didn't act like it. Captain Walsh met them with a grim salute and immediately led them toward the confinement cell. The outpost held its breath. This was no longer about a single ambush. This was something bigger, something darker. Eva watched from a distance, the wind tugging at her bandage. She saw Miller being led from the cell, his hands now bound in flex cuffs, his head hanging low. He didn't look at anyone as he was escorted toward the waiting helicopters. A broken man being swallowed by a machine he no longer understood. One of the unidentified men broke away from the group and walked directly toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We've debriefed Captain Walsh. We need to understand the weapon." He didn't ask. He stated. He led her back to the TOC, where the old AK-47 still lay on the map table like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. The man didn't touch it. Instead, he pointed a gloved finger at the rifle's receiver. "This rust. It's superficial. The bore is clean. The action, while stiff, is functional. This rifle was not stored in some forgotten cache. It was recently cleaned and deliberately aged." The words hung in the air, recontextualizing everything. The sabotage wasn't a simple act of hazing gone wrong. It was a calculated, professional setup. They hadn't just given her a broken rifle. They had given her a specific rifle, one chosen for its deniability, its untraceable nature. The broken M4 was just the first step, meant to force her into using this particular weapon. The realization was a cold chill down her spine. The scope of the betrayal was wider, deeper than she had imagined. Miller wasn't just a lone traitor. He was a piece on a board, and someone else was moving him. The man's eyes, cold and assessing, finally met hers. "The shot you made, Sergeant. 200 meters with iron sights, under fire, with an unfamiliar weapon. Your file says you qualified expert. It doesn't say you're a miracle worker." It wasn't a compliment. It was an interrogation wrapped in observation. He was questioning her story, probing for cracks, for any detail that didn't fit the narrative. He was looking at her not as a hero, but as a variable in a complex equation he was trying to solve. The gratitude of her squad, the respect of her captain, it meant nothing to this man. He represented a colder, harder truth. The fight for her survival was over. The fight for her credibility had just begun. The cold, assessing gaze of the investigator felt more invasive than the enemy fire had. He wasn't just doubting her story. He was dissecting it, looking for the lie he was certain was there. Eva felt a flush of anger rise up, burning away the exhaustion. She met his stare without flinching, her own eyes hardening. "The file doesn't mention my grandfather either," she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "He taught me to shoot with a Mosin-Nagant that had sights bent from stomping on it. He said if I could hit a target with that, I could hit it with anything." That lesson stuck. She didn't blink. The shot was luck. The training to take it wasn't. A flicker of something, not quite belief, but a sliver of professional respect, passed behind the man's eyes. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The interrogation was over, for now. He turned and left the TOC without another word, leaving her alone with the ghost of her grandfather and the chilling implications of his discovery. The rifle wasn't just old, it was staged. This was a conspiracy, and she had just blown a hole right through the middle of it. She was no longer just a witness. She was a loose end. The sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the outpost. The place felt different. The air, once thick with unspoken resentment, now hummed with a tense, wary energy. Soldiers glanced at her as she passed, but the looks had changed. The awe was still there, but it was now mixed with a new caution. She had not only taken down a Taliban commander, but had also exposed a traitor connected to something far larger than any of them understood. She was a hero, but she was also dangerous. She knew things. Captain Walsh found her later, standing at the perimeter wire, watching the mountains turn to purple silhouettes. "The investigators are satisfied with your account, Sergeant," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "For now. They've taken Miller away. This goes deep. Higher echelons. You understand what that means." He wasn't asking. He was warning her. The threat wasn't over. It had just changed shape, transforming from bullets in the open to knives in the dark, from a traitorous corporal to unseen, powerful figures who had just had their operation destroyed by a woman with a junk rifle. Eva nodded, her jaw tight. She understood perfectly. She had won the day, but she had made powerful, hidden enemies. The medal they might eventually pin on her chest would feel less like an honor and more like a target. The mountains, once just a battlefield, now felt like they were watching her, hiding countless secrets and untold dangers. The broken rifle had been a message, and she had answered it. Now, she had to wait to see what the reply would be. The silence of the coming night was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with threat. The ceremony was stark, a necessary formality performed on the dusty helipad under a searing sun. There was no band, no crowd of dignitaries. The audience was her platoon, standing at rigid attention, their faces a mixture of pride and grim understanding. Captain Walsh's voice was clear and steady as he read the citation. The words, extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, utter disregard for her own safety, hanging in the hot, still air. He pinned the silver star on her chest. The metal was cool against her uniform, a heavy, foreign weight. She saluted, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed on some distant point past the captain's shoulder. The applause was brief, respectful, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. The woman who had made that shot was still up on that ridge, fueled by desperation and rage. This woman, being decorated, was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Later, alone in the barracks, she held the medal in her hand. It gleamed, a perfect, polished thing. It felt insignificant compared to the memory of the rifle's kick against her shoulder, the sound of the round finding its mark. The recognition was supposed to be the end of the story, but it was just an intermission. The investigation into Miller was a black hole, sucking in information and giving nothing back. The men from the helicopter were ghosts. The higher echelons Captain Walsh had warned her about remained a silent, faceless threat. The medal wasn't a reward, it was a shield, making her too visible to eliminate quietly for now. She walked over to her footlocker and retrieved the old AK-47. The investigators had left it behind, its purpose as evidence seemingly served. She ran a cloth along the stock, not polishing it, but cleaning it, respecting it. This piece of junk, this tool of a betrayal meant to kill her, had instead given her and her men a future. It was the real trophy. It held the truth. They had handed her a broken rifle, a symbol of their contempt and their conspiracy. She had used it to break their plans instead. A new resolve settled deep within her, cold and hard as steel. The hidden enemies thought this was over. They thought she would be cowed by their silence, satisfied by a piece of metal on a ribbon. They were wrong. She had looked into the abyss of their betrayal and had not blinked. The fight had changed, but she was still a soldier. Her new mission was clear: uncover the rest of them. She placed the medal carefully back in its case and closed the lid. The ceremony was over. The real work was just beginning. Outside, the wind whispered across the Afghan plains, carrying secrets she was now determined to hear.